And in many societies, including our own, that are very heavily influenced by patriarchal trends, and frankly, I'd be hard pressed to find societies that aren't. Um, you see a trend towards consuming women as if they were goods. And this trend is especially apparent in countries where the economy starts just taking off. And in Edo, Japan, that's exactly what happened. You have this patriarchal society where women are in many ways controlled by men, and then you have, for example, the explosion of woodblock printing, which makes the reproduction of increasingly sophisticated, color, beautiful images increasingly cheaper and easier. And you have, for various reasons, which we'll also talk about later, a spike in literacy. Most Japanese people towards the end of the Edo period, in fact, the overwhelming majority of them, were literate, and this included peasants. This kind of shocked Westerners when they came to Japan. But one of the effects that this all had on the place of women in society, or the role of women in society, for example, is that it was much easier to indirectly consume women as, for example, beauties. There is a genre of woodblock printing called bijinga, which basically means prints of beautiful women, pictures of beautiful women, and here they are. Here are three examples. These women were very alluring, and they were meant to be presented as such. I'm not completely sure about all of them. This one seems, for some reasons, a little bit different, and I'm not exactly an art historian. But these women, I'm confident in saying, were courtesans. And famous courtesans, prostitution was managed and was legal in Tokugawa Japan as long as it was managed by the Tokugawa government or various domains. It was a very lucrative racket, or business, or business that was kind of run like a racket by these domains and samurai. But in any case, you have brothels promoting their women by getting them to pose for these kinds of basically woodblock prints, giving woodblock print artists the right to reproduce their image, to show off to the world what an elegant wardrobe they have, how well they are cultured, and come to our brothel. And some of these women became nationally famous. Now, how can I tell that they are courtesans? In part because of the way that they are dressed. You see it in this picture very clearly, and in this picture a little less clearly, but you can still kind of see it. The back of the neck is exposed. Right here, you see this kind of loose kimono that's coming off and showing the back of the neck, and here it's just outright, just in your face. And the back of the neck was, in Japanese culture, an erogenous zone. Different cultures eroticize different parts of people's bodies, and certainly men looking at women, the male gaze looking at the women in a sexual way, had in Japan produced a certain number of conventions. The woman, as viewed from the back, was that's how women should be viewed and appreciated in a sexual manner. Breasts were much less eroticized in Japanese culture, and in some ways, even the naked body was not that much in and of itself an object of intent that was supposed to promote intense sexual desire. Even in erotic prints, shunga, in which women also, of course, featured very prominently, because many of these were drawn by men. In fact, almost all of them were. Basically, even there, in the act of copulating, it's very, very common to see two human bodies or more that are partially clothed instead of completely naked, right? So when we see a woman depicted in this manner, for example, this is the best example, powdering the back of her neck, she is meant to be signaling, I am sexually available, and the fact that her image of doing this was printed and sold at relatively inexpensive prices so that anybody coming in from the countryside could afford one of these things and consume her vicariously. This is a very kind of very obvious way of demonstrating that that women were in many ways consumer goods in this society. Samurai women, by the way, were not expected to behave this way. This was for to become prostitutes or to be pictured in a very sexualized manner. Samurai women were supposed to remain chaste and until marriage, and remain faithful to their husbands, and to not show sexual desire in this way. These women who were consumed in this way were very often commoners who had been sold into prostitution at an early age, or kind of indentured themselves into prostitution at an early age. It was a prostitution, but in general, the so-called water business, the entertainment business that made use of women's sexualized forms. It wasn't seen as necessarily evil or you're going to hell because you do this. It was seen as something that was unfortunate and kind of sad. And so in that way, it's, you might have to do it, but, no good samurai woman should have to do that. So women were consumed in that way. As I said, also in shunga, the so-called spring pictures, these erotic prints that were basically ran the gamut from, softcore to ultra-hardcore pornography involving all sorts of fantastical creatures. And it helped inspire a lot of the erotic production that's going on in Japan today. I'm sure, as some of you have heard, in terms of Japanese animation producing these kinds of works. This has a very long tradition in Japan. Also sexual literature, basically the equivalent of Harlequin or bodice rippers or whatever you call them, romance novels. The more people read, the more light entertainment they wanted, and Edo period Japan was a very thriving market of this kind of light entertainment literature. And we've talked about this also a little bit earlier today. We touched on a lot of the themes involved in samurai marriage, women in marriage, but we didn't quite get to all of the points I was hoping to talk about in this slide. And the most important one is forget love. Love, as we understand it today, this romantic love of, I need to be with this person or I need to be with that person, there are instances of that being recorded in Japanese culture or in diaries. It wasn't unknown to develop a real specific, very strong attachment to a specific person, but it was seen as something that was tragic, usually. There are instances of husbands and wives falling in love with each other, but or recorded instances. I'm sure that many remained unrecorded and just happened. But in many ways, and especially as it comes down to us in all of these in the literature of the period, in the plays of the period, kabuki plays, which we'll talk about a little bit more, kind of popular entertainment, love was often seen as something that really got in the way of people's plans, where the heart overwhelmed the head, and where a lot of times the end result was tragic, including suicide. That was not uncommon. or not an uncommon trope. For example, a samurai falling in love with the daughter of a merchant, could just never work. And so while samurai were certainly permitted to have concubines and were permitted to have basically affairs as much as they wanted, samurai men, that is, if you really love someone and you wanted to marry someone and she's like from a different status group, well, there were instances in which rich merchant families would pay a great deal of money to have a daughter married into a samurai family, or a son sometimes, and become samurai in that way. Really, though, love was seen overall as something that meant trouble, and kind of had this romantic, fictionalized air about it. Marriage is very much about property rights, and I'm not sure what y'all's background is, but please remember that when you marry your sweetheart, you are signing a legal contract. I certainly, I'm happily married, and certainly I recognize very much that this is a part of marriage. It becomes intensely clear the degree to which this matters once you enter into this kind of a union, and certainly the samurai were very well aware of this, and this is one of the main uses of marriage, as we've talked about before. Virginity among samurai women at marriage was important. Once again, you did not want to confuse the issue of your issue, basically, who was possibly of illegitimate birth. If there were suspicions about samurai in that way, they could dog them for their entire lives, and parents did not want to confuse the chain of inheritance. So officially, as we've seen, male power was absolute over their wives. It was a law in the warrior code. I forget which code this was. This may actually go all the way back to the Joei code of the Kamakura Bakufu that was still in force during the Tokugawa period with some updates. But basically, it was enshrined in law that the husband may kill his wife for being lazy or bad. That is saying quite a lot. And there were instances in which this was done. But usually this did not, during the Edo period, and less as time went on, very, very few people ever lived their lives by following the letter of the law, and this is one of the best examples of that. There were many conflicts between many wives and many husbands during the Edo period, and very, 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 very few of them actually involved in the death of the woman, from, let's say, stemming from events that the man thought to be the woman's fault. In specific events, rather. There certainly was, unfortunately, a great deal of domestic violence during this time period. We do have records of this. And many women died as a result of long-term systemic abuse. But in terms of a samurai just saying, you have committed a grave sin and I will now kill you, wife, because you did not wash the dishes or something like that, or because you cheated on me, that was relatively rare. And of course, that's because if you killed your wife, there would be an investigation, domain authorities would get involved. If you were a Tokugawa vassal, then the Tokugawa Bakufu itself would get involved. And in this way, during the Edo period, kind of the growing complexity of the state, of the bureaucracy, and also these notions of settling conflicts in private while publicly claiming your right as a husband to do whatever the hell you wanted to do, these trends did overall serve to control violence, some forms of violence against women, in the same way that they controlled violence between social classes or between samurai of rival domains. So certainly the Tokugawa period was a patriarchal period, but in some ways Safety, physical safety, which was a one of the proudest accomplishments of that Bakufu. That is reflected in the private lives of individuals as well. Another way of attaching yourself to a male, if you were a woman and entering his household, was concubinage. We've talked about this a little bit before as well. Basically, you're not a wife, but you come just after the wives, and you are ranked in order of seniority, and powerful samurai would keep many concubines and would have many children by them, and if they were able to provide for all those children and give them fiefs, good for them. If not, this institution could potentially prove problematic. Basically, as with all families of all sizes and all permutations, a lot of whether or not this institution works in your case depends on what kind of person you are, and there were just as many variations in the forms of concubinage as there were people alive in Japan during this time who happened to be samurai. But in general, it wasn't just the case that marriage was between one man and one woman, and any other kind of sexual union was not legally recognized. Concubines did have legal status. So we've talked about the fact that during the Edo period, this patriarchal streak in samurai culture deepened. And I want to think for a second about why this was. And I urge you all to think about why this was as well. One of the thoughts that struck me, and that has been in the air, historians have been talking about this, of the period have been talking about this, was that basically it's ironic, but the end of war during the Edo period, it did make women overall safer, samurai women overall safer. Not as many castles were getting burnt down and rivals' families killed or stolen or things like that. So physical violence against women went down during the Edo period, but their role as warriors became ever less important. They still identified themselves as warriors, these women did. They were prepared in many cases to die in defense of their homes, or to commit suicide for the sake of preserving their family's honor and thereby, saving their children. But really, you were not expected in any real sense to actually have to defend your house or your castle or whatever, and commit suicide as an invading army is bursting through your gates. And because of this, the role of women as people who fought or who were prepared to fight, that went down, and the role of samurai as bureaucrats, as peacetime administrators, went up. And women were not pulled into the bureaucracy. In fact, in many ways, certainly there were, as we've talked about, including during this lecture in great detail, these cultural notions about why women were lesser than men in many ways, and these served as kind of influences to keep women out of public life in many ways. But also, there just wasn't a demand for more bureaucrats. In fact, during the Edo period, there were always more samurai than there were peacetime jobs for them. During the Edo period, many samurai were actually the equivalent of unemployed. They received a stipend from their lord because they were retainers and they had to be prepared to fight, and at least in theory. But there were never enough jobs to go around. In fact, for most administrative jobs, at least most of the important ones, you often had two or even more samurai filling the same position, and they'd kind of switch off day by day or week by week, or however that particular job handled their manpower surplus. So there wasn't this kind of demand which pulled women into the factories during World War I and World War II, for example. Nothing like that. You had the opposite of that. You had peace, and you had stability, and you had women frozen out of the public aspects of power, to be sure. So this is one of the ways in which, one of the reasons by which patriarchy intensified in Japan during this period. I believe this to be a convincing argument. There's also other factors, for example, increased cultural engagement among women who were increasingly literate, who could increasingly hire tutors, and appreciate, for example, works of ancient Japanese literature, many of which dealt with sex, extramarital affairs. The Tale of Genji is the primary example of this, and is the subject of a fantastic article by Peter Kornicki, which is just unfortunately just a little long, and I couldn't bear myself to assign it in this class, even though I was very tempted to. Wonderful article. Basically, as women are becoming smarter, or not smarter, that's a terrible way of putting it, as women are becoming more educated, and as they are gaining to appreciate the Tale of Genji and other works like that, this kind of creates a backlash amongst some Confucian samurai, who are aghast that women are now reading all of these supposedly salacious things, which, yeah, during the Heian period they were written by, women, but, we don't need to talk about that during this period because we are now warriors, and we don't want our women to get any funny ideas, these men claim. So in some ways, the growing sophistication of Japanese culture, the increased engagement by women through, in part, literature with the world outside of their house, that produced some anxiety in the samurai and caused a backlash. I think that's also a very convincing argument for why patriarchy increased in strength during this time period.